Hermann von Wissmann was a German explorer and administrator in sub-Saharan Africa in the late 1800s. Like the title says, this video will be about the institution of slavery that he observed among the natives and Arabs from the East, an institution that he abhorred and sought to assist in putting an end to. During his travels in equatorial Africa, Wissmann regularly came upon native traders, notably the Bakuba, who were looking to buy slaves and salt. Native soldiers were hired by Wissmann and his expedition for purposes of protection during their travels. These soldiers were sometimes sent to native villages carrying back and forth messages between the village chief and the expedition. While visiting native villages, some of these soldiers used the power and prestige of being in the employ of a white man to plunder the people of goats, provisions, and slaves. Wissmann noticed that everything the Baluba people imported was paid for with slaves. The Baluba themselves were also made into slaves by other tribes. As part of a restitution payment a chief made to Wissmann and company for attacking and robbing them and their native allies, were 30 Baluba slaves. Though he was ardently anti-slavery, age-old African custom forced Wissmann to accept slaves as payments and presents from chiefs and other natives. The refusal to accept these slaves would have been taken as a grave insult, impeding the expedition's progress, and possibly resulting in violence against them. A second reason why Wissmann accepted of these slaves was the fact that they would have a much easier time with him than with their native masters. A large number of these slaves given as gifts and payments ended up working at a European factory at Luluaburg. They received clothes, food, medical treatment, full wages, and were soon after given their liberty. After receiving their newfound freedom, most of these former slaves built their villages around the European stations or factories instead of returning to their tribal village. Wissmann observed that black traders from Angola and Benguela had come to Bihar to work as carriers or attendants as part of their slave trading operations. They went into areas where a gun was unknown, the people being relatively weak and easily preyed upon by those who were armed. They made arrangements with the native chiefs in these areas to buy large numbers of slaves from them, and also joined up with slave hunting parties. The slaves thus taken were then sold to the Bakuba for ivory. The male slaves the Bakuba purchased from them were strictly used for human sacrifice rituals at funerals. This killing of slaves at funerals was extremely common in West Africa and in some parts of Central Africa. The higher the rank of the deceased, the more slaves were brutally executed at their funeral. Wissmann and company came across cannibal tribes who wore headdresses made out of the fingers of the natives they had killed and eaten. The fingers had been cut off at the second joint, tied to wooden pins, and fastened upwards, almost seeming to project out of the wearer's hair. Wissmann repeatedly witnessed cannibal tribes cut off and throw away the fingers and toes of their victims before cooking and eating them. While in these cannibal regions, one of Wissmann's men died, and his grave was dug in the middle of the expedition's camp, one of the main reasons being the hope that the surrounding cannibals would never discover the grave and dig up and eat the dead body, a common practice among many cannibal tribes and groups. Wissmann was in Africa when the famous slaver Tipu Tib was a powerful figure in the African and trans-Saharan slave trade. He was witness to the slave hunting, hierarchical coalition he and his followers formed with the slave-trading, cannibal Kailbu people. Tib also owned many half-caste African and Arabic slaves near Africa's east coast who went on slave-raiding expeditions for him. These half-castes of Tib, in general, were more brutal than Tib himself, and had less moral scruples with which they carried out their designs. These half-caste slaves paid tribute to Tib and stole slaves for themselves as often as they could. Tipu Tib and other Arabic slavers were more focused on making native kings, chiefs, and royalty into their vassals, while the half-caste slaves from the East Coast avariciously sought to simply obtain for themselves as many slaves as they could with no concern for the future state of the country. During his travels, Wissmann came across a large slave-hunting army led by an Arabic man named Said. This army consisted of 500 black and half-caste slaves from the East Coast belonging to Tib, and a large host of Kailbu cannibals who Tib had subjugated and compelled to join his army. At one point, this army went on a punitive expedition against the cannibal Basanj people for having killed and eaten some of their men. When entering the Kailbu country, Wissmann and company came upon 2 deserted villages. In one of these villages there was a group of 17 skulls arranged in a circle, belonging to the victims of cannibal feasts. Victims is not so much the right word, many of those eaten having most likely also been cannibals and slavers, or aspiring slavers themselves. Said and his people were with Wisman at the time and used this occasion to express their disgust and say that these cannibals need to be extirpated, meaning genocide. Oddly enough, many Kalebu cannibals had joined Said and his army. These Kalebu essentially acted as tools in the hands of the Arabic slavers from the east. Wisman was invited to Said's camp, where at the entrance were 50 chopped-off hands providing ornamentation at the front gate. The hands were in a state of putrefaction and smelled horrible. These had been erected by the cannibals among Said's army, their notion being to display what they believed was their power and prestige. There was a chief named Lupungu who was subjugated through force and made tributary to Tipu Tib. Prior to this, Tib had sent multiple men to Lupungu carrying messages and so forth. Lupungu had these messengers decapitated and gave their heads to his Kalebu subjects, something that was considered by the Kalebu to be a special treat. As part of what was believed on the part of Tib and said to be a punitive expedition against a native tribe, many of the alleged offenders were brought in as prisoners. Said then proceed to use these natives as target practice with his revolver. After being shot multiple times, the bodies of the dead prisoners were given to Said's auxiliary cannibal troops, who cut the bodies into pieces and carried or dragged their portion over to the fire to be cooked and eaten for their dinner. While in Africa, Wisman and company met Tipu Tib's son, Zafu. The insolence and mockery with which he treated Wisman and the expedition required them to use every modicum of restraint they possessed. When they told him they had come to the region to put a stop to the slave trade, Zafu and his entourage laughed in their faces. In an arrogant, nonchalant, degrading fashion, they jeeringly imitated the way that a heavy-set sailor among the expedition walked. They also criticized and insulted the appearance of Wisman and Lamarinal, another European expedition member, apparently believing them to be ugly and ridiculous-looking. Zafu began speaking to them about the war against slavery in Africa that Europeans were engaged in at the time, specifically speaking about a battle at or near Stanley Falls, where he described the wounds and death of white men, calling them cowards. Wisman and company restrained themselves as their blood boiled in anger at this. Owning an abundance of slaves and wives in sub-Saharan Africa was the aspiration of native men. They went about obtaining slaves for themselves in a wide variety of ways, with little to no moral scruples about how they did it. Wisman noticed a different type of slaver in Africa that can most accurately be described as scavenger slavers. These scavenger types would lie in wait, hidden in the bush, and capture a slave or two at a time who were straggling behind the slave caravan they were part of. They would also approach slave caravan camps as traders and secretly induce slaves to run off. If these slaves took the bait, the scavenger slaver would capture them once they made it into the woods. These scavenger slavers typically then sold their slaves to other native and Arabic slave traders. Wisman was witness to slave caravan after slave caravan throughout his time in Africa, and the following quote, he describes the typical slave caravan he saw. Our march on this large caravan road enabled us to make intricate studies of the imports to, and exports from, Central Africa. While those coming towards us only carried arms and ammunition into the interior, we met a few days later 3 caravans who were taking the proceeds of these imports to the coast, some ivory, and hundreds of slaves fastened together with long chains and neck yokes in sets of from 10 to 20. The weaker women and children who were not expected to escape were only tied with ropes. Those who had to be especially watched were walking by twos in the slave fork, in which the neck is fastened. One would scarcely credit the miserable and lamentable condition the unfortunate human chattels were in. Their arms and legs were almost fleshless, their bodies shriveled up, their looks heavy and their heads bent, while they were marching along eastward into an unknown future, farther and farther away from their homes, separated from wife and child, from father and mother, who had perhaps escaped into the woods or had been struck down in defending themselves. It was a revolting scene to watch the daily distribution of food in the camp of such a caravan. The hungry creatures, with dilating eyes, were crowding round the spot where one of the overseers was stationed to distribute victuals, now and then using his stick to drive back the crowd that were pressing close around him. A small pot about the size of a tumbler was filled with corn, maize, or millet, and poured into the goat's skin with which they covered their nakedness. Some of them, too tired to rub or pound the corn, simply boiled it in water or roasted it in a saucepan over the fire, and then devoured it in order to satisfy their craving hunger. Before the different sets were allowed to lie down, they were once more driven out of the camp, and then they would throw themselves down near one of the large fires to rest their exhausted bodies. The slaves were mostly bound together according to their powers of marching, without the least regard to sex. Scarcely the fourth part of these reached the maritime countries or the plantations of the coasters they were bound for. The large Arab settlements in the interior, chiefly Ujiji and Tabora, absorbed great numbers of slaves, especially the former, which is notorious for its bad climate. A working slave, in distinction from the female slaves who are put into the harem, at Ujiji is said not to stand the climate above a year. One day when I was lying in wait for buffaloes near the camp, I was surprised to see, instead of the game, a boy of about 8 years of age come out of the thicket, cautiously approaching a place that commanded a view of our camp. When I left my covert, he was at first going to take flight, but afterwards followed me into the camp. The boy had escaped from a slave caravan, and he told us that he had always picked up any remnants of food that might have been left in the places of encampment after the departure of caravans. He had passed his nights on a tree, in the branches of which he had arranged his bed. He joined us on our march, but died soon after of smallpox, to which disease more people of my small caravan had to succumb. Wisman here describes witnessing slaves being loaded onto a dhow, and the horrible loss of life in their transportation. We completed our march through the monotonous forests of Ubajive, and the smooth surface of the Tanganyika lake put us pleasantly in mind of the sea. We halted close to the beach at the part of Mtoa, where there were several dhows which had been brought from Ujiji by Arabs, bound for the Lualaba. These were now to take up a slave caravan that was in waiting. This lake is the cause of many a sacrifice of human life. The small sailing vessels from Ujiji are so crammed with people, that in bad weather, which in the rainy season often sets in with thunderstorms, those in charge of them are frequently obliged to throw a number of slaves overboard so as to save at least part of them. It is a fact that on such an occasion lately an Arab had 12 slaves thrown overboard so as to save his 2 valuable musket donkeys. Throughout the region, various Arab, half-caste, and native slavers competed with each other for slaves, territory, etc. The Wawemba people took slaves to Lake Nyassa and used them to buy guns and ammunition from Arabs. The slaves they brought were strictly women and children, the men of the villages they raided being immediately beheaded. Among the Wawemba, a man's rank was determined by how many heads he had taken in these raids and in their wars with enemy tribes. This was the reason why Wisman and the expedition saw so many skeletons with no skulls. Lieutenant Paul Lamarinal, a European soldier in the expedition, was witness to an incident of natives being punished by a chief for having stolen from the expedition. When Lamarinal heard that they had been apprehended, he asked to see them. The chief told him that was impossible, the thieves having already been cut up and eaten. Lamarinal was incredulous and became angry, thinking that he was being lied to. Sooner than later, his disbelief turned to terror and loathing as he watched a Basonge native walk by with human arms, legs, and various pieces of human flesh. Lamarinal felt powerless to do what was right in this situation. If he took away the human meat by force from these cannibals, it would have almost guaranteed a call to war. The Arabs and their cannibal auxiliaries had twice the men and twice the guns as the expedition at the time, and it would have meant death and a trip to the cannibal pots if the natives' customs were transgressed upon. This is the end of the video. Go to the channel's main page and watch the rest of the videos. There is much more on the way as well.